Cold open shock hook. Inside a packed courtroom, Judge Harold Whitfield mocks a soft-spoken 12-year-old girl named Amara Johnson for asking a simple question during a community hearing about her grandmother's home, drawing laughter from a gallery. Rewind plus emotional backstory. We go back 1 week to Amara's home, revealing she has spent months studying her grandmother's property paperwork after the city tried to seize the house, guided by her late grandfather's old law notebook. Rich/public setting build. The courtroom is introduced in full detail, polished wood benches, city officials, reporters, and a rigid hierarchy where children are expected to be seen and not heard. First humiliation layer. Amara is dismissed when she tries to point out an error in the city's documents, the judge cutting her off and joking about her age in front of the room. Repeated injustice/system pattern. Flashback beats reveal Judge Whitfield has a pattern of favoring city development interests over working-class families, dismissing complaints and mocking self-represented citizens for years. Second good character/silent witness. A quiet court clerk named Denise, who has watched this pattern for a decade, tries to gently help Amara and hints that this has happened before to families who couldn't fight back. Villain crosses the line. Judge Whitfield threatens to have Amara and her grandmother removed from the courtroom and dismisses their case outright without reviewing the evidence she brought. Hidden proof/evidence stacking. We learn Amara has been secretly working with a legal aid mentor, and that her grandfather was once a respected civil rights attorney whose case files reveal the judge's own courtroom has ignored precedent for years. Authority entry/power walk. The Chief Justice of the State Court, accompanied by a state bar investigator, walks into the courtroom mid-session after receiving Amara's formal complaint filed through her mentor. Big reveal plus proof scene. The Chief Justice reveals that Amara's simple question exposed a documented clerical fraud in the city's seizure filings, proof that Judge Whitfield ignored for years, and that Amara's grandfather's old case files predicted exactly this outcome. Villain collapse plus justice. Judge Whitfield's authority collapses publicly as the Chief Justice overturns the ruling. The state bar opens a formal investigation, and the courtroom sees him for what he truly is. Aftermath plus emotional ending plus CTA. Months later, Amara's grandmother keeps her home. Amara is honored with a junior legal scholarship. Denise is promoted, and the story closes with a message about listening to the voices we underestimate, plus a YouTube call to action. Sit down, little girl. This is a courtroom, not a school project. Laughter rippled through the gallery. Somewhere near the back, a city attorney chuckled behind his folder. Judge Harold Whitfield leaned back in his high leather chair, clearly pleased with himself, as if he'd just delivered the wittiest line of the morning. 12-year-old Amara Johnson stood at the small podium meant for citizens addressing the court, her hands folded neatly in front of her, wearing a navy cardigan her grandmother had ironed that morning. She did not sit down. She did not flinch. She simply waited the way she had learned to wait, patiently, the way her grandfather used to tell her that patience wasn't weakness. It was strategy. "I only have one question, Your Honor," she said again, her voice steady despite the laughter still settling around her. "The filing date on page 4 doesn't match the notice my grandmother received. I just want to know why." "Sweetheart," Judge Whitfield said, his tone dripping with condescension, "I'm sure it's very impressive that you can read big words in a legal document. But this is an adult matter. Perhaps you should let the grown-ups handle it." More laughter. Somewhere in the front row, Amara's grandmother, Ruth Johnson, sat with her spine straight and her jaw tight, gripping a worn manila folder in her lap like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Amara didn't sit down. She looked directly at the judge, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face. Not fear, but the quiet, unshaken certainty of someone who already knows they're right and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. "I'll wait, Your Honor," she said softly, "but the date is still wrong." The judge waved a dismissive hand, already moving on to the next matter on his docket, already certain this small interruption meant nothing. They had no idea what that simple question was about to unravel. 1 week earlier, in a small kitchen on the east side of town, Amara Johnson sat at the table long after her homework was finished, a stack of papers spread out in front of her under the glow of a single overhead light. Her grandmother, Ruth, had raised her since she was 6, after Amara's parents were killed in a car accident that still occasionally visited Amara in dreams she never talked about. Ruth had worked as a school cafeteria manager for 30 years to keep their small house on Maple Street, the same house Amara's grandfather, Theodore Johnson, had bought with his own hands back when a neighborhood was still considered undesirable by the banks that had refused him a loan 3 separate times before finally relenting. Theodore had been a civil rights attorney in his younger years, before his hands grew too unsteady to hold a pen and his mind began drifting in his final seasons. He'd passed 2 years ago, but he'd left behind something Amara treasured more than any toy or trinket: a worn leather notebook, filled margin to margin with his careful handwriting, notes on cases, on courtroom procedure, on the quiet ways that paperwork could be twisted against people who didn't know how to read it closely. "Read everything twice, Amara Bug," he used to tell her, tapping the notebook with one weathered finger. "The truth is always hiding in the details nobody bothers to check." When the city sent a notice claiming Ruth had missed a property tax deadline and moved to seize the house through eminent domain for a new development project, Ruth had been too overwhelmed to fully understand the paperwork. But Amara had taken her grandfather's notebook down from the shelf, and night after night, she had cross-referenced every date, every stamp, every signature on the city's filing against what little she understood of procedure, determined, in her own quiet 12-year-old way, to save the only home she had ever really known. She found a mismatch on a Tuesday night, a filing date that didn't match the mailed notice by exactly 11 days. 11 days that, under the law her grandfather's careful handwriting explained, would have made the entire seizure notice invalid. That night, she showed her grandmother the notebook page, tracing the discrepancy with one careful finger the way her grandfather used to trace case citations for her, explaining slowly what an 11-day gap could mean under the law. Ruth had listened, half in disbelief, half in quiet pride, and told her granddaughter that if she believed she was right, she deserved to be heard, whatever room she had to stand and say it. She had no idea, closing that notebook and turning off the kitchen light, that in 1 week she would be standing in a courtroom being laughed at for trying to say exactly that out loud. The 3rd District Courthouse sat at the center of downtown, an old stone building with tall marble columns and heavy oak doors that had swung open for 100 years of the city's disputes. Inside, the main courtroom stretched wide and formal. Dark wood benches polished to a shine, a high judge's bench framed by the state seal, and rows of gallery seating that filled quickly on hearing days like this one. Community property hearings drew a strange mix of people: city planners in tailored suits reviewing development documents, reporters from the local paper hoping for a quotable moment, attorneys representing the city's redevelopment office, and ordinary residents like Ruth Johnson, sitting quietly with folders held together by rubber bands, hoping to be heard. Judge Harold Whitfield had presided over this courtroom for 19 years. He was known in local legal circles as efficient, decisive, and, among the attorneys who worked closely with the city's development office, remarkably easy to work with. He moved through his docket quickly, rarely allowing lengthy testimony from self-represented citizens, and had built a reputation for keeping his courtroom orderly, a word that, depending on who you asked, meant either well-run or simply intolerant of interruption. The gallery that morning was fuller than usual. A new downtown revitalization project had brought a wave of eminent domain hearings, families being asked to give up long-held properties in exchange for city compensation that rarely matched what the land was actually worth. Most of them sat quietly, resigned, unfamiliar with the legal language stacked against them. It was into this room, formal and imposing, that a 12-year-old girl in a navy cardigan had walked beside her grandmother, carrying nothing but a manila folder and a decade-old notebook, hoping someone would simply listen. She had no idea how badly this room needed someone like her to finally speak up. The hearing had begun ordinarily enough. Ruth Johnson's case was 4th on the docket, wedged between 2 commercial property disputes that the judge moved through with brisk efficiency. When her name was called, Ruth stood, folder in hand, and began explaining, in the careful, respectful voice of someone in used to courtrooms, that she believed there had been an error in the city's notice. "Your Honor, the date on the filing doesn't match what we received in the mail," Ruth said. "My granddaughter found." "Ma'am, I don't have all day for every discrepancy someone believes they've found," Judge Whitfield interrupted, not unkindly at first, simply dismissively, the way a man speaks when he has said the same sentence to 100 people before. "The city's development office has reviewed this filing. It's in order. But if you just look at page 4, Ruth tried again. "Ma'am, I have reviewed the filing." His voice hardened slightly. "I don't need to review it again because someone at home believes they found something the city's legal department missed." That was when Amara had stepped forward, gently touching her grandmother's arm, and asked, in the small, clear voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in her bedroom mirror, if she could point out the exact discrepancy herself. That was the question that had earned her the mockery. That was the moment the whole courtroom had chosen, almost as one, to laugh along with a powerful man rather than listen to a quiet girl holding a folder. But one person in that courtroom hadn't laughed. Near the sidewall, the court clerk, a woman named Denise Carter who had worked in this building for 11 years, had gone very still, watching Amara with an expression that wasn't amusement at all. It was recognition. That small detail, a clerk's stillness in a room full of laughter, would become the first crack in Judge Whitfield's entire story. This was not the first time Judge Whitfield had waved away his citizens' concerns in favor of moving his docket along quickly and keeping the city's development office satisfied. 2 years earlier, an elderly man named Walter Briggs had come before this same court, trying to argue that his auto repair shop, the only black-owned business left on a block slated for redevelopment, had been undervalued by nearly 60% in the city's compensation offer. Judge Whitfield had ruled against him in less than 4 minutes, citing the city's appraisal as final, despite Walter's independent appraisal sitting untouched in the case file. 8 months before that, a young mother named Selena Ruiz had tried to explain that her family's rental assistance paperwork had been filed with the wrong case number, causing her family to lose their housing voucher during a jurisdictional dispute. Judge Whitfield had told her, in front of a full gallery, that clerical errors are not the court's responsibility to untangle, and dismissed her case without reviewing the paperwork she'd brought. And just 4 months ago, a retired postal worker named Gerald Okafor had attempted to challenge a similar eminent domain notice, only to be told by Judge Whitfield that his objection was the kind of thing that happens when people don't hire a real lawyer. None of these cases had ever been formally reviewed. Complaints filed with the county's Judicial Oversight Office sat in a slow-moving queue, understaffed and overwhelmed, the kind of bureaucratic silence that lets patterns repeat themselves for years without consequence. A courtroom doesn't announce when it has stopped serving the people in it. It simply keeps moving quietly until someone finally has the standing and the evidence to make the room stop. Each of these families had walked out of that courtroom believing the fault was somehow their own, that they simply hadn't understood the paperwork well enough, hadn't hired the right attorney, hadn't spoken the right language of law. None of them had known that the same judge, the same courtroom, and very often the same city office sat behind every single one of their losses. Amara Johnson, standing quietly at the podium with a manila folder and her grandfather's old notebook, was about to become exactly that person. Denise Carter had worked as a court clerk in this building for 11 years. She had filed thousands of documents, watched hundreds of hearings, and learned, the hard way, that speaking up too loudly in Judge Whitfield's courtroom could mean a transfer to records processing in the basement, where 2 clerks before her had quietly disappeared after raising concerns. But something about the girl standing at the podium made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years. During the brief recess before the next case, Denise crossed the room and crouched slightly beside Ruth Johnson's bench, keeping her voice low enough that only they could hear. "Mrs. Johnson," she said gently, "I need you to hold on to that folder. Don't let it out of your hands. And whatever you do, don't let this hearing end without getting a case number for your objection." Ruth blinked at her, surprised. "I tried to explain the date issue, but he wouldn't even look." "I know," Denise said quietly. "This isn't the first time. I've watched him do this to families for years. I tried reporting a pattern to oversight 18 months ago. Nobody called me back. Amara, sitting close enough to hear, looked up at Denise with the same quiet recognition Denise had shown her minutes earlier. "You need to understand something," Denise added, glancing toward the judge's now empty bench. "This courtroom does this every single week to people who don't know how to fight back. You might be the first person in a long time who actually found something real." She didn't know it yet, but in less than an hour, the state's Chief Justice was going to walk through that courtroom's heavy oak doors, and Denise's small act of quiet courage was about to matter more than she could have imagined. When the hearing resumed, Judge Whitfield's patience had thinned even further. "Mrs. Johnson, given the city's documentation is in order, this court finds no basis for further review," he said, already reaching for his gavel. "This matter is dismissed. The property transfer will proceed as scheduled." "Your Honor, please," Ruth said, her voice cracking slightly for the first time. "If you would just look at the date." "Ma'am, I have made my ruling." His voice rose now, sharp and final. "If you continue to interrupt these proceedings, I will have the bailiff escort you and your granddaughter from this courtroom." The gallery went utterly silent. A reporter near the back straightened in her seat. Denise, standing near the side wall, felt her stomach drop. Amara stepped forward one more time, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Your Honor, I have a copy of the notice that was actually mailed to us. The postmark is right here." She held up a single page, her hand steady despite everything. "I said this matter is dismissed." Judge Whitfield snapped, banging his gavel down hard enough that the sound cracked through the room like a small gunshot. "Bailiff, please escort this family out." A uniformed bailiff moved toward the front, and Ruth rose slowly, gathering her folder, her face carefully composed even as her eyes glistened. Amara stood beside her, chin lifted, refusing to let the tears gathering in her own eyes actually fall in front of a room that had already laughed at her once. Judge Whitfield straightened his robes, satisfied, already reaching for the next case file on his docket, utterly certain that this small interruption was over. He had no idea that Denise Carter had already sent an encrypted message to a number saved in her phone as legal aid, Marcus, and that the file attached to it had been sitting ready to send for exactly this moment. What Judge Whitfield did not know, what almost no one in that courtroom knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, Amara's after-school mentor, a legal aid attorney named Marcus Webb, had begun quietly helping her build a formal complaint after she brought her grandfather's notebook to their tutoring session, asking him to check her math on the filing dates. Marcus had recognized the name in Amara's grandfather's old notebook the moment he saw it. Theodore Johnson, one of the founding attorneys of the city's original tenant rights coalition decades earlier, a man whose case files were still referenced in law school seminars on procedural fairness. Marcus had spent years admiring Theodore's work without ever knowing his granddaughter sat 2 seats away from him at the community center every Tuesday afternoon. When Amara showed him the mismatched filing date, Marcus didn't just confirm she was right. He pulled the county's public record database and found something far larger, a pattern of filing date discrepancies across at least 6 other eminent domain cases in Judge Whitfield's courtroom over the past 3 years, all involving the same city development office, all resulting in rulings that favored the city within minutes of the hearing beginning. He filed a formal judicial complaint 11 days ago, attaching digital timestamps, notarized comparisons, and a sworn statement cross-referencing every date against the state's official filing procedure. He also, quietly, reached out to a contact at the State Bar's Investigations Division, a contact who happened to report directly to the office of the Chief Justice. Denise's message, sent the moment the bailiff moved toward Ruth Johnson, was the final piece. It confirmed, in real time, that the pattern Marcus had documented on paper was happening again, live, in front of a packed gallery. There was one more detail Marcus had uncovered, one he hadn't shared with anyone outside the State Bar's Investigations Division. 2 of the 7 flag cases involved a shell company registered to a relative of a senior official in the city's development office, a company that had quietly purchased 2 of the seized properties within weeks of the rulings, then resold them months later at triple the price. It wasn't proof of anything criminal yet, but it was exactly the kind of thread that, once pulled, tends to unravel far more than anyone expects. The file was no longer sitting in a queue. It was already moving. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a sound that carried through the silence like a struck bell. Every head turned. A tall woman in dark judicial robes walked in first, flanked by two men in state bar credentials, her expression calm but unmistakably serious. Marcus Webb followed close behind, a leather folder tucked under his arm. Denise straightened near the side wall, relief and fear mixing plainly across her face. Judge Whitfield looked up from his bench, and for the briefest moment, his expression flickered, recognition, then something closer to alarm, quickly smoothed over into practiced composure. "Chief Justice Alvarez," he said, his voice suddenly careful. "This is an unexpected visit." "I'm sure it is," Chief Justice Renata Alvarez said, her voice even, carrying easily across the silent room without needing to be raised. "I received a formal complaint 11 days ago regarding filing irregularities in this courtroom. I intended to review it quietly through normal channels." She paused, glancing toward Ruth and Amara, still standing near the bailiff, the family halfway out of their seats. "Then 20 minutes ago, I received a live report that a 12-year-old child was being removed from this courtroom for pointing out the exact discrepancy described in that complaint." The gallery had gone completely still. The city attorney who had chuckled earlier now sat frozen, his folder forgotten in his lap. "So, I decided," the Chief Justice continued, stepping further into the room, "that this matter deserved my personal attention after all." Judge Whitfield's confidence, so certain just minutes earlier, was beginning to crack at the edges, and the whole room could feel it happening. "Your Honor," Judge Whitfield began, straightening his robes with the practiced authority of 19 years on the bench, "I assure you, this courtroom has followed proper procedure. The city's filing was reviewed and found to be in order." "Was it reviewed?" Chief Justice Alvarez asked. "Or was it assumed to be in order because the city's development office rarely gets challenged in your courtroom?" She nodded to Marcus, who stepped forward and opened his folder on the clerk's table. "This is a formal complaint filed 11 days ago," he said, documenting filing date discrepancies in 7 separate eminent domain cases heard in this courtroom over the last 3 years. Each discrepancy follows the same pattern: a mailed notice postmarked after the legal filing date, which under state procedure invalidates the seizure notice entirely. He turned to a specific page. The most recent example is the Johnson family's case, identified independently by a 12-year-old girl using nothing but public record comparison and her grandfather's old case notes. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. The Chief Justice turned to Amara. "May I see the notice you brought today?" she asked gently. Amara, still holding the single page with the postmark, stepped forward and handed it over without hesitation. The Chief Justice examined it for a long moment, then held it up beside a printed copy of the city's official filing. 11 days, she said quietly. "The postmark on the notice your family actually received is 11 days after the legal filing deadline. Under state procedure, that makes this entire seizure notice void." "I didn't know about the discrepancy," Judge Whitfield said quickly, his voice rising in pitch. "If the child had simply been permitted to explain." "She tried to explain," Denise said suddenly, stepping forward from the sidewall, her voice shaking but clear. 3 times. I watched it happen. She was mocked and dismissed each time." The Chief Justice looked at Judge Whitfield with the flat, unreadable expression of someone who had reviewed far too many complaints just like this one over the years. "This isn't the first flag pattern in this courtroom, Judge Whitfield. It's simply the first time someone brought proof loud enough that it couldn't be quietly filed away." Judge Whitfield's excuses came quickly now, the composed authority of the last 19 years dissolving in real time in front of the very gallery he had ruled over so confidently just minutes earlier. "It was a busy docket," he said. "I move through cases efficiently. That's not misconduct, that's good judicial management." "Efficient for whom?" the Chief Justice asked quietly. "The record shows every one of these 7 discrepancies was resolved in favor of the city's development office. Not one was resolved in favor of the resident who raised the concern. I was protecting the integrity of this court's schedule He tried again, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. You were protecting a pattern that took a 12-year-old girl and her grandmother's court records to finally expose, the Chief Justice said. A pattern that a court clerk tried to report 18 months ago and was ignored. Judge Whitfield looked around the courtroom, at Denise, who would not look away this time, at Marcus, standing firm with his folder of evidence, at the reporter in the back row now typing rapidly into her phone. He looked, finally, at Amara, still standing quietly beside her grandmother, the single postmarked page now resting in the Chief Justice's hand. "Please," he said, quieter now, all the earlier condescension gone from his voice. 19 years on this bench. This is everything I've built. So is this family's home, the Chief Justice said. And you nearly took it from them in under a minute, because you decided a 12-year-old with a notebook wasn't worth listening to. The gavel that struck the bench moments later did not belong to Judge Whitfield. Chief Justice Alvarez formally vacated the ruling on the Johnson property, citing the invalidated filing notice, and ordered an immediate stay on all 7 flagged eminent domain cases pending full review. Judge Whitfield was relieved of his docket effective immediately, pending a formal state bar investigation into judicial misconduct and potential collusion with the city's development office. His face had gone pale the moment the word investigation left the Chief Justice's mouth. He gripped the edge of his bench, his earlier composure entirely gone, his robes suddenly looking less like a symbol of authority and more like a costume that no longer fit. A few attorneys who had laughed along with him earlier that morning quietly gathered their things and slipped out of the gallery, unwilling to be photographed anywhere near this unraveling. The city attorney sat frozen in his seat, already dialing his office on a phone he'd forgotten to silence. "You can't simply remove me from my own courtroom," Judge Whitfield said, though even he seemed to hear how hollow the words sounded now. "I already have," Chief Justice Alvarez said, closing Marcus's folder with a quiet finality. "A bailiff will escort you to my chambers, where we can discuss the terms of your suspension in private. The same courtesy, I imagine, you rarely extended to the people in this room." Denise stepped forward and gently helped Ruth Johnson back to her seat, tears finally sliding freely down the older woman's face. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. Amara stood quietly beside her grandmother, holding her grandfather's old notebook against her chest, and for the first time all morning, allowed herself to smile. 6 months later, the Johnson house on Maple Street still stood exactly where it always had, its porch light glowing warm against the early evening sky. Ruth Johnson sat on that same porch most evenings now, no longer flinching every time an official-looking envelope arrived in the mailbox. The state bar's investigation into Judge Whitfield concluded with his permanent removal from the bench and a referral for further review of the 6 other flag cases, several of which resulted in overturned rulings and formal compensation for families who had lost property years earlier under the same pattern of ignored filing errors. Denise Carter was promoted to senior court administrator under the courtroom's new presiding judge, and she personally helped establish a public filing review office, a place where ordinary residents could have their paperwork checked by trained staff before ever stepping into a courtroom, free of charge. Marcus Webb's legal aid office received a grant, largely credited to the publicity from Amara's case, to expand its youth mentorship program, training students to understand basic legal literacy the same way Amara's grandfather once had, one careful notebook page at a time. And Amara herself, now 13, was awarded a junior legal scholarship by the State Bar Association, alongside an invitation to shadow the Chief Justice's office each summer until she finished high school. At the small ceremony marking the award, she stood at a podium far smaller than the one at the 3rd District Courthouse, holding her grandfather's old leather notebook, and said simply, "He always told me the truth is hiding in the details nobody bothers to check. I just decided to check." Have you ever watched someone dismiss a person simply because they seem too young, too poor, or too quiet to matter? What would you have done in that courtroom? Drop your answer in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of people who are underestimated.